The Nazis wanted to use gold to finance the ongoing war. And this is a true story of an incredible escape and real heroism. This is a story of a group of people who, against all the odds, managed to sneak away all of Norway's reserves, 50 tons of gold, from right under the noses of the Nazis. So in Norges Bank in Oslo, Norway's gold reserves consisted of 3,000 gold bars and 39 barrels of gold coins. The gold reserves had a book value of 240 million kroner in 1940, which is roughly equivalent to 35.8 billion kroner today, or £3.5 billion sterling, and this could not be allowed to fall into the hands of the Nazis. So early in the morning of April 9th, 1940, the gold reserves were secretly loaded onto 26 trucks. As soon as they were fully loaded, the trucks drove north towards Lillehammer. The last truck set off just as German soldiers were marching up Karl Johans Gata, only a few meters from the bank. Then in Lillehammer, the gold was transferred from the trucks and onto the train, and with the entire gold reserves on board, the journey continued towards Romsdalen and Andalsnes. But with bombers circling overhead, the train had to stop at the Stabem switchback tunnel to wait for darkness. Between the steep mountains, the train route was hidden from bombers, and eventually the train arrived safely at Andalsnes station, where everybody breathed a sigh of relief. Now all that remained was to load the gold onto a waiting boat. But before they could start, a loud engine noise was heard from the sky. Soon after, the ground shook as bombs from the large military planes were dropped all over the town. So the crew jumped back on board the train and reversed as fast as they could back up Romsdalen. Several of the train carriages were hit and the gold became visible, but under the high mountains they managed to get to safety and avert further bomb attacks from the air. Unfortunately, the ship that was supposed to be the Gold Salvation had to leave the quay, as it is now too dangerous to be in Andalsnes. So after 5 more days of waiting, the crew received a message that a boat was on its way to Mulda to pick up the king. This could also be a way out for the gold transport. So trucks from the local population in Andalsnes were requisitioned, and the 50 tons of gold were once again transferred from the train and back onto trucks, which then set off for Mulda. This concludes the storytelling, but not the escape of Norway's gold. It would be several more weeks before the volunteers managed to get all the gold to safety, to the UK and then further on to the USA and Canada. But they did it without losing a single gold bar. This amazing and daring escape of the king with Norway's gold has become an iconic part of Norwegian war history and has been written about in many books, and more recently in the Gold Run film, which you can see on Viaplay, Netflix, NRK TV, and sometimes even on YouTube.